Hey, what's up? I'm Ty Robertson. I'm a guitarist from Atlanta, Georgia, and this is my rig rundown. This is a rig that I've built for sort of an indie or dream pop or shoegaze kind of sound. It also doubles as a praise and worship rig, and I think for those genres, I've managed to keep it pretty small and easy to understand, so I'm excited to show it off. For my guitar, I'm playing a 1994 Made in Mexico Telecaster, which has been refurbished, but it's still mostly stock. The bridge pickup is a Porter 9T bridge pickup, which is a P90 that's just kind of compact for a stock Tele. But other than that, everything's pretty much the standard. For my amp, I'm playing through a Vox AC30 S1 Creamback, which is being attenuated and fed directly into an interface. I've also got this Boss Katana 50 Mark II, which I also tend to run direct. I mostly just run direct nowadays. And so I'll be talking more about that later, about how I created this direct rig and how you can create your own with your own amp, or maybe just create one on a budget with other things that you might have. If you want to actually skip to that part of the video, just skip to this timestamp where I talk about amps. But otherwise, I'm just going to hop right into talking about pedals. So here's my board again. Here's the order that the pedals are in. And so just going through them one at a time. First up is the Dunlop Mini Volume X. It takes a little bit of getting used to. I came off of using like a Boss volume pedal, which has a much more gradual and like easy to use sweep because those are huge. But I think once you get used to the size, like it's pretty usable, and there's not any noticeable like significant tone suck or anything. It uses a 250k ohm potentiometer, which is like standard for passive pickups. So I've got it first in the chain to try and get the most linear sweep and volume and like the least tonal changes as possible. Anyways, here's some quick sweeps. Next is the Electro-Harmonix Pitch Fork Harmonizer. This is basically like the poor man's version of the Pog or the Digitech Whammy. It's sort of an amalgam of those two pedals. For what it costs, though, I think this tracks really well, especially if you've got it like first in your pedal chain or like directly after a compressor. It's polyphonic, so you can basically play whatever you want, and it should track pretty well. Although there is like a millisecond of lag, but I mean, I guess that's just where the price point comes in because it's the most affordable, out of these kind of pedals. But for me, I just use this for like layering octaves 90% of the time, and that's where I really think it sounds best. Especially with like more ambient stuff, like a down octave sounds, super fat and really fills things out, especially when you're playing like high stuff. And then vice versa, an upper octave when you're playing slightly lower stuff really makes it sound stabby and present. So here's some examples of both of those methods. Other than that, the one other thing I like to do with this, it's got this really cool feature where you can reprogram the Momentary mode to act like a Digitech ricochet and like momentarily sweep through a series of frequencies. You actually need an expression pedal in order to set this up and like save the sweep speed. I'll put a link in the description to a video that shows you how to do it because it's a bit of a lengthy process. But anyways, once it's saved, you can just leave it. And whenever you switch into momentary mode, it'll act this way. So you can do like these cool sort of shoegazy bends when you do this. It sort of acts as a substitute for having like a tremolo bar on your guitar. So I've got it just bending like a half step down. And here's how you might use that in like a practical setting. So next is the Boss BD2 Blues driver. You've heard this several times already. This is my favorite overdrive. It's like a nice halfway between like an overdrive and a fuzz. The blues in the name is like sort of a misnomer. It can get really bluesy if you want, but it can also get incredibly heavy. I never use it really past noon on the gain, but if you listen to bands like All Them Witches, they used it a lot in like their early work, and it just straight up sounds like a fuzz pedal. But yeah, you hear this pedal used a lot in like American punk and indie and a ton in J-rock. If you're a fan of any of those genres, you're guaranteed to love it. So here's an example of how I like to use it. So I've got this Earthquaker Devices Warden after my main overdrive, which is not the most common place to put a compressor, but I particularly like the sound of a compressor after the blues driver, especially this compressor. This is a trick that I learned from Megan L, aka Koalaru, so shout out to her. She uses a Fairfield compressor after her BD2, and so I decided to try the same trick, but with the Warden. And since the Warden is an optical compressor, it's got a much more kind of natural, like studio sounding squash to its sound. It also has this ratio knob, which controls the mix of the compression. So it's sort of acting as like a master tonal control for the blues driver, as well as a way to kind of control how it sits in a mix. You can use it to like add presence and brightness for lead lines, or you can actually use it subtractively if you want to like pull yourself out of a mix to go to like a rhythm sound. But here's a demo of how I like to use it, just to add a little bit of presence, a little bit of brightness, and that nice kind of compressor pop, especially on the neck pickup. So the Earthquaker Devices Arrows serves sort of a similar purpose to the Warden. I'm kind of using these almost like gain stages, even though they're mostly just boosting volume and presence. Because this also boosts the upper mid-range frequencies a tad. It's not just a straight volume boost. So again, if I just like want even more presence, I can add this in. On a tube amp, I like it just kind of slightly above unity most of the time, because I don't want to add like too much extra gain. In this case, it's just kind of making the sound tighter. And I've got it last in my gain stage, so it's really controlling like the overall volume of everything that comes out. So I like to use it for clean lead lines, just to give them a little bit of extra bite, and also for stacking with the BD2, again, kind of like a gain stage, in order to give it a little bit more gain when it needs it. So here's some examples of both of those. So next is the TC Electronics Third Dimension. It's really just like an affordable mono version of the Boss Dimension C. It's a little bit more subtle than the Dimension C if you ever listen to like side-by-sides, but I actually think that might be to its advantage because I kind of like it better. It still preserves like your high end and gives you this really clear, bright sound just like the original. But you can, I think, do more switch combinations on this. I don't think the original lets you put all the switches down. Because the way that this one works, you can have all the switches off or slowly add them until they're all down. So with them all off, it kind of has this almost like phaser-y kind of sound, like a soft phaser. And then it becomes more chorusy as you add switches until you've got all of them down, and it just turns into this like really heavy wash, which is awesome. So here's some examples of the lightest sound and the heaviest sound. Not a lot to say about the TR2, but y'all know what it does. So this model of AC30 doesn't come with a tremolo circuit, so I wanted to just get something that sort of emulates like an amp tremolo where it's not like precise. You just sort of dial in a speed and a depth, and that's it. So the TR2 is kind of a classic, but it has this problem where it tends to have a volume loss issue when you turn it on. It feels like your volume's going down. Modern models come with like a little trim pot on the inside that you can adjust with like a screwdriver to change where your volume sort of mid-level sits. This one's a bit older, so it doesn't have that. So I actually opened it up, soldered a 10K mini trim pot across the R9 slot on the board, and that sort of does the same thing. And now I can adjust the mid sort of volume in the sine wave to be where I want it to be. So there's not really very much volume loss. So here's what it sounds like on and off. The Electroharmonics Canyon is after that, and I need to go through this one quick because I feel like you could do a whole 30-minute video just on this. I mostly just use it for the tape mode and the deluxe memory man mode, both of which are great approximations of the analog original versions of those sounds. But what makes this particular pedal so great is you have the ability to edit the algorithms on each of these presets around the wheel. So when you hold down the tap divide button, you get access to a bunch of like hidden settings, which are unique to each preset. Like you can change the simulated tape age or the amount of chorusing on the memory man, the EQ of certain presets, the mix of like octave effects, the percussiveness of repeats, just like really specific stuff. And once you've made those changes, it saves it for the next time that you're on that preset. So you can just like endlessly tweak this to get your sort of dream delay sound. And again, I've tweaked the heck out of the tape and memory man modes. So here's those two back to back. Alright, and finally we're at the Matthews Effects Astronomer version 2, revision 2, which is a mouthful, but all that means is that at the moment this is the most up-to-date version of this pedal. So if you see one online, it might look a little different, but they're all basically the same. If you're a fan of ambient reverb or shimmer reverb, this is a pedal dedicated to just those two things. And the reason I like it so much is these dual knobs and dual switches. Basically, the way that this works is the primary switch corresponds to the top row of knobs, and the secondary switch corresponds to the bottom row of knobs. And the two rows of knobs are just duplicates of one another. They're just basically two copies of the same pedal controls. And on the side of the pedal, there's two copies of this little switch that lets you switch between reverb algorithms. So basically, you can treat this like two completely independent reverb pedals, which is the coolest thing ever. You can also plug in external switches or an expression pedal into the side jack to also remotely control the two different reverb algorithms that you've got set up. And since these are like analog presets, basically, you can reach down and edit them at any time. It's not like saving them into a bank. They're just always accessible. So this is like the most interesting concept for a compact, like multi-preset reverb pedal I think I've ever seen. So even though it's got its limitations, like for instance, I really only use the hall reverb because I think that's the one that sounds best. I think this is like super interesting and cool, and I think just for all the versatility that it offers, like in a live setting especially, it's totally worth it. So anyways, speaking of the hall reverb, I'll just do a couple quick little demos of some hall reverb sounds that I'd like to use on this. Alright, so talking about direct rigs, the way that I'm running this amp to my PC is like this. On the back of the amp, there's a plug that says external speaker 16 ohms, and that's for sending the power amp signal to an external speaker cabinet. I've got a speaker cable, which, by the way, if you're going to do this, use an especially made speaker cable, not an instrument cable. They look similar. But make sure you've got the right cable. But I'm connecting that to a 2-notes torpedo Captor 16. And I'm using the 16 because the output is 16 ohms on my amp. Use a different one if yours says something different. I'm not powering the Captor or using any of its built-in cab sim features. It's all passive. And then on the line out on the Captor, it's connected to a Mooer Radar speaker simulation pedal, which I have loaded with an official Celestion AC30 cabinet simulation. This is called an IR file, if you're not familiar with this kind of setup, and you can buy these online, and I bought this one. So then that runs with a TRS cable to my cheap little Behringer Euphoria interface, and that is the sound that you've heard this whole video. This maybe isn't exactly the most affordable setup, but since I already own the amp, it's definitely, it felt worth it to get the Captor and the Radar. But something cool that you can do if you don't want to buy a torpedo Captor or you don't have like an external speaker out on your amp, you can just buy the Mooer Radar, load it with whatever cab sim you want, and then plug that into the effects send if your amp has an effects loop, or if your amp has a line out, you can plug it into the line out. If you plug it into the effects send, just make sure that you plug something else into the effects return to mute it, like a pedal that's off or something, just because your amp will still be live. But yeah, that's like a really simple and easy way to do it, and you should get a pretty similar sound. Using the 2 notes is just like the way to get the most sort of raw, accurate version of the sound that's coming from the power amp. I should also mention there's a bit of EQ on everything that you heard. The Radar lets you put EQ on your cab sims. I put a bit of extra high end on my cab sim because IRs for some reason tend to sound a little bit boxy. I think that adding a bit of high end gives you a bit of extra fidelity, which is great. And I do that with pretty much all of my cab sims. So that's a nice little trick as well. If you try this out and it just doesn't quite sound like a real amp, try putting an EQ on it. Add a little bit of low end if that's what it's missing, a bit of high end, just trying to, fill out that spectrum of sounds that you feel like you should be getting. So I mentioned the Boss Katana earlier, and I do really quickly want to show off how I've got that set up and how it stacks up in comparison, especially considering it's a lot smaller and cheaper than like a tube amp and this, whole elaborate setup. So this is how I've got mine set up. So I'm playing on the clean channel with the variation switch turned on. That's exclusive to the Mark II. If you have the Mark I, that switch won't be there. But all that really does is it makes it sound more like a Vox style preset. And inside the software, I've got this kind of setup. The cab resonance is set to deep, and the presence is at 90. In the system settings, I've got a global EQ that looks like this. Again, this is an EQ to add some fidelity back into the sound, a little bit of extra low end, a little bit of extra high end. And in the line out settings, I'm using blend, which is just a blend of the two existing speaker simulations that it comes with. With my personal setup, I really think this sounds pretty good. I've ran this into PAs a bunch of times, and I really think it stacks up against a lot of the other direct rigs that cost a lot more if you know how to use it. So here's some sounds from that really fast, just for comparison. And lastly, if you don't have any of this stuff and you're like trying to create a direct rig for yourself and you don't want to, go and purchase like a Strymon Iridium or a Walrus ACS1 or any of those, slightly more pricey rigs, you can always just buy a preamp pedal of pretty much any kind as long as it's sounding like an amp preamp and pair it with a Mooer Radar, or even run it straight into an interface and run the cab sim on your PC. Or you can just run all of this on your PC. You can simulate, your entire amp and cab and everything as long as you don't have any sort of latency issues. Like, that's completely viable. I've played with people who don't even own an amp and they just do that for everything. They bring their laptop with them wherever they go. And for a lot of people, that's way more affordable. So, yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. If you've never done a direct rig, just keep in mind it's some sort of preamp generally running into some sort of cab sim. And the higher quality the cab sim, generally the better it's going to sound. I think the cab sim is really the key to all of this. So if you can get like a digital, accurate, official cab sim, you'll get a much more accurate sound. Anyways, I hope that helps somebody. I know that this is a confusing topic for a lot of people, and I figured if I'm going to cover it in a rig rundown, I might as well kind of run through it as quickly as possible so that anybody who needs the reference can have it. Anyways, I hope this rig rundown has helped somebody either make a decision on pedals or amps or guitars or whatever, something maybe they were going to try or maybe we're going to buy. But thanks for tuning in, and hopefully I'll have some more new music-related stuff in the future. And see you, and happy playing.